First of all, the conflict that we have in the Middle East is multiple. It used to be said that the core of the conflict in the singular in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, that went by the window. When you see Iraq collapsing, Syria collapsing, Yemen collapsing, Libya collapsing, and everything else in turmoil, nothing to do with us. The core of the conflicts in the Middle East is the battle between modernity and early primitive medievalism. That's the core of the conflicts.
Why is there no peace in the Middle East? Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked this exact question, and he gave an amazing answer, and I've got a lot to say about it. Go have a look.
Me to explain why we don't have peace. You have until tomorrow? Here's my short answer. I have two rules when I'm in a press conference. When I have journalists, I put a board on and they ask me the questions. I write all the questions. I write all the questions. And then I go through each one, and here's my answer to that, here's my answer to that, here's my answer to that. And this one, I'm fudging. I don't want to fudge. I actually tell them that I fudge. I don't want to fudge. I want to tell you what the answer is. The reason, first of all, the conflict that we have in the Middle East is multiple. It used to be said that the core of the conflict in the singular in the Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, that went by the window. When you see Iraq collapsing, Syria collapsing, Yemen collapsing, Libya collapsing, and everything else in turmoil, nothing to do with us. The core of the conflicts in the Middle East is the battle between modernity and early primitive medievalism. That's the core of the conflicts. The core of the specific conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is the persistent Palestinian refusal to recognize a Jewish state in any boundary. This is why this conflict persisted for 50 years before there was a state, before there were territories, before there were settlements. If that were the core of the conflict, the settlements, why did it take place when my grandfather landed in Jaffa in 1920? Jews were murdered then for what? There was no West Bank. There were no settlements. Now that continued in 1921, 1929, 1936, 1939, 1948. What was that all about? 1967. For nearly half a century, we were being attacked because there was a persistent refusal to accept us in any boundary. Well, we got into these territories as a result of the conflict. And what Arab propaganda has done by endless repetition is to turn the result of the conflict into its cause. Now, how do you know that that's the case? Because we left Gaza completely, every last centimeter. And they're still firing rockets at us from Gaza. And when you ask them, why are you doing this? Is it to liberate the West Bank? And they say, yeah, sure, that too, but no, it's to liberate Palestine. You know, Akko, Haifa, Jaffa. They always get back to Jaffa. So now I turn to the other guys, to the Palestinian Authority, not to Hamas. At least they don't practice violence, which is important. And I say, well, what about you? Are you willing to recognize the Jewish state? Are you willing to recognize the fact you'll have a nation state for the Palestinian people? How about a nation state for the Jewish people? I mean, after all, we've only been there almost 4,000 years. And we recognize there are two peoples there. We're willing to make the deal. Are you willing to make the deal? Are you willing to recognize the Jewish state? Because there's no point in making another Palestinian state, another Arab state that will continue the battle from improved lines against the Jewish state. Are you willing to end the conflict? Give up the claim of the so-called right of return. Make peace. And you know what happens when you ask them that? They move. And they say, oh, we're willing to recognize Israel. I didn't ask Israel. I said, are you willing to terminate all claims to the Jewish state. You won't get Jaffa. You won't flood us with refugees. Are you willing to do that? And the answer is they're not. We will have peace when the Palestinians will accord us what they ask us to accord them. We're willing to let them have a state of their own. They have to reconcile themselves to the fact that we have a state of our own, and it's here to stay. That is the core of the problem. In the Middle East, modernity against medievalism, Israel and the Palestinians, the persistent refusal to recognize a Jewish state in any boundary. I hope that changes, but I have my mind on making sure that until it changes, that yes, we work up the economies to create at least an economic vested hope in the future. If the Palestinians follow the prescriptions I've given here for market development, they'll be better off economically and we'll move 2 steps closer to peace too. Thank you very much.
So there you have it. The reason there is no peace is very simple. They don't want us there. You know, what Prime Minister Netanyahu did not say in his remarks is how much Islam has to do with this. Let me explain. If you go back to before World War I, almost none of the countries that you see in the Middle East actually existed. So it's not just about there not being a Palestinian state. There was no such thing as Lebanon. There was no such thing as Syria. There was no such thing as Jordan or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. None of these countries existed, okay? And it's not like they only didn't exist for a period of time. The Arab world, and this part of Asia, meaning the Middle East, was not a place where what we know as countries with borders and clearly defined borders and lines and nationalities ever existed. Okay, for 500 years, 400 years until World War I, the area was governed by the Ottoman Empire. Before that, it was governed by other various empires going all the way back to temple times. Okay, it's always just been these vast expanses where you have different tribes and ethnic groups living in different areas, different regions. Okay, if you look at a map from before World War I, again, none of these countries existed. There's no such thing as a Jordanian person or an Iraqi person or a Syrian person, and certainly not a Palestinian. Okay, none of these countries existed. And then along came these Western diplomats after World War I, after the Ottoman Empire fell, and they just carved up the Middle East and created all these states. And that was the end of the Ottoman Empire, which meant that it was the end of the Islamic Caliphate. Now, according to Islam, any area that was ever governed by the Islamic Caliphate is the top priority to make it part of Islam's territory again, meaning the goal of Islam is to rule the entire world, but areas that were never yet conquered by Islam are second priority. They're not as important as areas that were once conquered by Islam. Any land that was ever once governed by Islam must never, ever be under the authority of anyone other than Muslims, than Islam itself. And that is why the Muslim world can never accept a permanent Jewish state in the land of Israel, because the land of Israel was part of the Ottoman Empire, so they refused. Now, this should explain something that Prime Minister Netanyahu, another point that he didn't make, but he kind of almost made, which is the fact that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, so to speak, predates 1967, when Israel conquers Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, and then suddenly everyone wants there to be a Palestinian state. It predates that. He talked about how it even predates the state of Israel itself. You go back to the 1920s, and Jews were being massacred by Muslims, by Arabs in the land of Israel. But I want to make a different point. Since 1967, but really in the last few decades, everyone screams about how Israel is occupying certain territories, Judea, Samaria, known as the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, and that these are Palestinian areas that are meant to be a Palestinian state. So let me just ask a simple question, or for those of you who want to fight the information war, you can use this question on anyone who makes this claim that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory. Ask them the following question, and this is the killer question, okay? Before 1967, Israel did not control Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, right? From 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, or really from 1947, when the UN partition plan decided to break up this area into different states, and they created a Jewish state, and they offered the Arabs an Arab state in those territories. Then there was the Israeli War of Independence, and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, was conquered by Jordan. Okay, Jordan ruled it from 1948 till 1967. During that time, the Gaza Strip was controlled by and owned by Egypt. Okay, during that time, again, the areas that everyone today says should become a Palestinian state and that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory were under the control of Egypt in Gaza and Jordan in what's called the West Bank. During those 19 years, there was no movement, there was no call by anybody to create a Palestinian state in those areas. Why not? They weren't in Jewish hands, they weren't in Israeli hands. Why didn't the Jordanians create a Palestinian state? Or why wasn't anyone calling on the Jordanians to not occupy the West Bank and create a Palestinian state? Why didn't anyone call on Egypt to not be occupying Gaza and create a Palestinian state? The answer is nobody cared. No one wants a Palestinian state. No one's interested in that. They just want to make sure that Jews don't control any of the land in this area. So long as those areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, were under Islamic rule, they were under the rule of an Arab Muslim country, nobody cared. No one was interested. It's only after the Jews conquered this area, it was only after Israel conquered these areas in the Six-Day War, in a defensive war, that they were attacked. It was only after Israel conquered them in the Six-Day War that suddenly there was created this brand new cause, creating a Palestinian state in those areas because they were conquered by Israel. So again, to sum up what Prime Minister Netanyahu said, very simple. The reason we don't have peace is that the Muslims, the Arabs in this area, refuse to allow Jews to live in our ancient homeland. They deny that it is our ancient homeland. And until that goes away, the only way we're going to have peace is what we call peace through strength, that Israel is going to have to defend itself and make it clear that it's just not going to work if you're trying to get rid of us. And you're better off dropping all of this evil ideology and this genocidal desire to wipe out the Jews. Better to drop it and make peace with Israel, and everyone will be better off.